All right, so I'm going to start with the quote from John Locke, from my all-time favourite quotes, which happens to be the quote which was on the Declaration of Rebellion in 2018. I think it's got lost somewhere since then, many different meanings of that word. But it goes as follows, which is, to love truth for truth's sake is the better part. I knew I was going to forget it. Does anyone know it? It's the better part of perfection in this world. That's it. And the C plot of all other virtues. So I quite like it because it's got that old worldly sort of feel about it, hasn't it? And I think it reminds us that we're part of this long tradition. And one of the reasons I wanted Theo to do that thing they did was just to get a sense that we're all sitting here feeling slightly miserable that it's not full of people, but this is the long, glorious and inglorious British radical tradition, right? It goes like this, doesn't it? You know, you get a little bit of a heat and everyone goes and joins the party, and then for 30 years, 5 people in the room going, where is everyone? But it's different this time around, as I'm going to talk about. But what I want to say about that quote, and there's a few fundamental things I want to say, but this is one of the fundamental things I want to say, is the reason why that quote was put at the beginning of the Extinction Rebellion declaration was to make a sort of line in the sand about what is most important in being a radical throughout the ages. And it's not just the British radical tradition. That notion that truth is the first virtue is a transcultural thing, right? It's people all around the world, indigenous communities, you know, traditional Eastern communities, British, it's the same idea. And the idea is, unless you're telling the truth, then you're corrupting yourself. You're going to rot your soul. You're going to become mentally ill, to use the modern phrase. And so for me, it's the North Star of my life, right? I don't actually mind when I'm talking to 2 people or 5,000 people. What I'm concerned about and what keeps me going is it true or isn't it? Because that's the most important thing. And of course, the great paradox, and the reason we put it there, is in end times, in times of civilizational collapse, the paradox is those that tell the truth become the most successful, right? Because everyone else is heading into expediency, and as John Locke says, that corrupts people. And the big theme, I think, of our society at the moment, and for the next 10 years, and for the last 10 years, is the big lie, right? And it's the big lie that I want to deal with in this talk. And that big lie is everything's sort of okay, you know? And we've got that big lie coming back after COVID, haven't we? Which is one of the reasons not that many people in the room, right? Is that it's sort of still okay. You know, we've looked into the abyss and decided it's terrible, but it's sort of okay. Everything's sort of okay. So people forget about it again, but it's not okay. So I'm going to talk about the climate crisis, interestingly enough. I'm not going to talk for hours about it. Obviously, you all feel you're experts in it. I'm sure you are. But I'm going to give you a few little caveats about what I've been told over the last year or so, to sort of introduce the whole fatness of where we're at. And I'm doing that obviously because, as we all know, you know about the climate crisis. You have to get into that headspace to understand what you need to do. So if I don't talk about it, you're going to be going, this is a mad idea. And of course, I am going to be talking about something practical because that's what I do. Okay, so one of the things about being a co-founder of XR is people ring you up and they go, oh, can you talk to this scientist? You know, can you talk to this diplomat? And obviously I'm going, well, yeah, why not? And then I talk to the scientist and he tells me, you know, something beyond horrendous. And for 2 days, I'm a bit wiped out by it, like we all are when we read about this stuff, and you sort of pull yourself up. And so for me, like the rest of my life, I'm probably, if nothing else, going to be going around the towns of this country telling people what scientists have told me, because I can't really live with myself unless I do it, because at a minimum, people have a right to know. So I'll just choose 2 or 3 little stories. So the first one, and some of you may know this, is about 5 or 6 weeks ago now. There's an article in The Conversation. I don't know if you know that website, but it's like academics talking to normal people or trying to. And there's this article by 3 climate scientists, and they've got 80 years of experience at the top of the science, climate industry, as it were. And it's a mea culpa. It's a confession, right? 6 years after 2015. This is what they said. I don't know if you read these articles like in The Guardian, you always have to read to about the 6th paragraph, and then they just tell you it's bad news. And then they spend the rest of the article saying, they're very surprised and policymakers should do something. But it's in that little paragraph. Anyway, in that paragraph, it says, words to the effect, and I think this is more or less the exact quote, says, at Paris 2015, we did not know a single scientist who thought that 1.5 degrees was feasible. We did not know of a single scientist. I mean, how many thousands of scientists were there? They didn't know a single scientist who thought that 1.5 was feasible. And I've done a Facebook post about it, and I said to people on the Facebook post, stick that quote on your fridge and read it every day for a month. And then you'll start to begin to understand how totally fucked the situation is. That not only are we heading to the end of the world, but we're being lied to every step of the way. In a structural sense, it's not just a few bad apples. The whole of the scientific establishment has sold us a lie for 6 years, right? I'm mad as hell about it, to be honest. And the reason I'm mad as hell about it is at the beginning of Extinction Rebellion, I don't know if you remember, there was that report, wasn't there, in October 2018, saying we've got 10 years left, because we've got to stay below 1.25. So the whole of the climate movements globally, the whole of the climate space has been talking about 1.5. But 2015, they all knew it wasn't possible. This is the reality that I am going to be trying to communicate to the British people for the rest of my life, right? Which is we're being systematically lied to, and we're still being systematically lied to, as we know, G7 and all the rest of it. Go on, man. It's not feasible to stay below 1.5. It's locked in. I mean, I did talks 2 years ago, and I'll share some of the stats a bit later. And everyone's going, yeah, Roger's a bit extreme on that. But I was only telling you what people have told me, right? I'm not in the business of exaggerating. I'm just telling you how it is. So we had Chris Hedges on Zoom last night. I don't know if some of you know Chris Hedges, probably the most famous radical intellectual in the States, arguably. It's an amazing guy. And he was talking about the prophetic tradition. And what it occurred to me when he was doing that talk, and I think he was saying this in the talk as well, is the prophetic radical tradition comes out of the experience of betrayal and being lied to historically. It's like society's lived this lie, and some people, and that's why you're here tonight, don't want to go along with it. They don't want to go along with that lie. So what I suggest we have to do, I'm a sociologist, so I do this as a profession in inverted commas, is you've got to interpret what people say. You can't just take a scientist and go, well, as a scientist, he said X. No, you've got to look at the social context of what that scientist is saying. And I got into the Zoom with one of these guys, and I wrote to him, said, I'm Roger Hallam, co-founder of Exile, let's have a chat. So I got him on Zoom and said, is this true? Because I didn't want to get it wrong. He said, yeah, it's true. And I said, well, so what's the story? He said, well, all these establishment scientists, the white middle class, tenure professors, this is his quote. He said, they don't want to rock the boat. You get it? They don't want to rock the boat. So they lie. So if we want to be good sociologists, what we have to do is look at who is more likely to tell the truth. And someone who's retired is more likely to tell the truth because they haven't got an axe to grind, right? They haven't got a position. So don't fall into this illusion that, so-and-so is an expert. It's not whether they're an expert, it's about the context in which they're saying it. So if you want to know what's really happening, I suggest listen to Sir David King. So the great thing about Sir David King isn't that he was like the chief scientific advisor to the Blair and Brown administration, so that's pretty important. The most important thing about Sir David King is he's retired, so he doesn't give a shit, right? So what does he say? 6 weeks ago in Australia, he said, we have to move rapidly. I believe that in the next 2 or 3 years will determine the future of humanity, right? In the next 2 or 3 years, right? He's an establishment scientist. He wasn't just giving a throwaway comment, right? As it happens, he's in the Guardian yesterday, he's changed it to 5. Do you know why that is? Because he was interviewed by the Guardian. Got to be a bit more respectable. See how it goes. So, the reason he's saying that is he thinks it's too late to cut carbon emissions. We have to have massive geoengineering, by the way. So if you want to know the inside story of where the scientific community is at, that's where they're at, right? It's been left too late. Better, that's the situation. So then he said, I'm trying to be professional by reading quotes. Not like the old days when I was mixing up my references. Right, we are today at 500 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, all the greenhouse gases. We have already passed the tipping point. We are already in a negative carbon budget. There is much discussion about how much carbon budget there is left to burn. There is none. Okay? There is none. This is the chief scientific advice of the Blair and Brown administration, top establishment scientists. There is no carbon budget. We've already burned too much. We have to go into reverse. So, there's only like 20 of us in this room, but it doesn't actually matter, right? That's the facts. This thing is not going away, right? And this is one of the most important things I'm going to try and communicate to you is this is not another iteration of the great glorious tradition of British radicalism, right? In the great glorious tradition of British radicalism, bad things happen and then they go away, right? Sooner or later they go away. Slavery was bad and then it went away. Hitler was bad and then it went away. This is not going away. In 2 years' time, there'll be 1,000 people crowded into this town hall, right? Because there'll be the first ecological 9/11. And then they'll be coming out. This is the fundamental reason why we have to act. And I'm going to say more about it. All right. So, as you know, when all these scientists do their presentations, they say, well, it's really bad, and then they sort of finish, don't they? They don't actually tell you what's going to happen. So my third little nugget of horror, as it were, is I'm just going to pluck this paper out, come out all the time. There was a paper out last year, peer-reviewed, top science journal, called The Future of the Human Niche. So these 3 top establishment scientists, blah, 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 10 years research to write the paper, whatever it was. And in the paper, it says at the moment, 1% of the world is 30 degrees centigrade, right? So 1% of the world is like the Sahara, it's really hot, you can't grow anything. So at 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, 20% of the world is going to be at 30 degrees. 20%. Okay? And then he said, at 2 degrees centigrade, this is another complete, ridiculous Alice in Wonderland point, right? But the whole scientific establishment uses this thing about 2 degrees, 3 degrees, right? That's the global average, isn't it, right? But I don't know if you've noticed, but most human beings don't live in the oceans. They live on land. So why don't we have the temperature on land? Seems pretty obvious. So what's the temperature on land? So it turns out in this paper, after doing X years of research on it, the average temperature on land at 2 degrees is 7 degrees. Well, that's going to get people talking a bit more, isn't it? Right, 7 degrees, that's 15 degrees on a hot day. That's the end of your allotment, right? So I thought, oh my God, right? So I wrote to him, Roger Hallam, co-founder of Exile, I'd like to have a chat. So I get on Zoom with him, and he's a Dutch guy, and he's in his local park walking his dog. And I said, it's 2 degrees, 7 degrees inland. And he said, yes. All right. And he said, yes, it was all shocking. You always read that in the article. It was all shocking. And then he said, so we went back and redid the figures. You know how long that lasted? 2 years. These guys didn't make this up, right? They didn't, get into the pub and go, hey, it's about 7. They just spent, 2 years with the biggest computers in the world to work out it's 7. So it might not be 7, right? It might be 6 or 8. It's not 2. So where the thing hits the ground, right, is what does that mean? What does that actually mean? What it actually means is 1,000 million people living in areas which are uninhabitable at 2 degrees. At 2 degrees in 15 years' time, maybe 10, maybe 5, maybe 20, who knows, right? It's coming along. So that's 1,000 million people. And then they usually leave it like that. But let's not leave it like that. Let's just look in Wikipedia and find out what the relationship is between 1,000 million people on the move and all the other aspects of social breakdown, right? So you can look it up. In Syria, there were 10 million refugees, but there were 500,000 people lost their life. So it's not like these people are just going to pop up and move. It's going to be war. 10% of them are going to die in war, give or take, right? And then the real taboo is how many women are going to be raped. So you can look at the Congo. In the 2000s, so 5 million people died in the Congo. No one really talks about it. And even less people talk about the 2 million women who were raped. That's the reality of what 2 degrees means, right? I was talking to someone in Exile, in the media section, and she was talking to the head of the agricultural agency in the UN, top guy, and he said privately, because he won't say it publicly, he said, if you think Syria's bad at 5 million refugees, wait until there's 50 million people coming from the Sahel. So that's where we're at. I mean, we sort of know it, but we don't know it, don't we? It's like social collapse. Yeah, that sounds pleasant, but we don't hone in on it. But that's what we need to do, and we need to be in that space of horror in order to actually gain the courage to do what we need to do. That's what the tradition of radicalism is all about. All right, so we're at 1.3 degrees. Okay, we're not at 1 degrees, we're 1.3, 1.25 according to NASA, rounded up. I did my O-level stats, right? 1.25, that's 1.3, isn't it? So let's go for 1.3. Between 2000 and 2010, temperatures increased by 0.2. Between 2010 and 2020, it was by 0.3, give or take a little bit. So let's do the maths. 1.3 plus 1.3 equals 1.6. We're going to be going over 1.5 degrees before 2030. really not complicated. That's where we're at. That's why all those scientists in 2015 said 1.5, no, not going to happen, left it too late. And you know, incidentally, why they did it, right? Con all the people in the global south that are going to care about them. They said, yeah, we'll stay below 1.5. That's sick. It's a sick joke. Because they knew all the time that the small island states were going to be submerged, right? You know, it's like, dare I say it, the Nazis with the concentration camps, isn't it? Yeah, we're fine. We'll look after you, just get on the train, right? We're fine. We're going to look after you. The G7 are going to get their act together and scale to 1.5, right? No, they're not. They just put it in to con you. That's what happened. Okay. So I'm going to give you some quotes from papers. Carbon lag. See, people told me off for not doing references, so you're getting it. 0.75 to 1 degrees C is locked in because of the carbon lag, right? Because what was coming out 10 years ago is making it warm now, right? What's coming out now is going to make it warmer in 10 years' time. There's a little bit of dispute about this, so, you know, maybe it's not right, but maybe it is. Here we are, 2021, climate change volume 11. 0.75 to 1 degree, it's locked in. Okay, global dimming. Everyone knows global dimming, right? There's pollution in the atmosphere because of carbon pollution from fossil fuels. We're going to cut the carbon, we're going to cut the fossil fuels, right? Carbon's going to fall to the ground, the pollution's going to go. That means that there's less shading of the sun. It means that the sun's rays are going to be hotter. Not really rocket science, right? We've known it since 2005. There was a Horizon program about it, dare I say it. We don't talk about it anymore because it's too embarrassing, right? But here it is. Removing aerosols, that's the pollution, induces a global mean surface heating of 0.5 to 1 degrees. Samset. Nature Communications, volume 11, blah, blah. Okay, and then we've got Arctic ice. So Arctic ice, confirmed last year, it's going to go before 2035, regardless of what we do. Unless we do some amazing geoengineering and what have you. So this is Wonderland et al. 2020 at 400 parts per million. We're well past that, but let's assume we're at 400 parts per million. There's 0.4 degrees centigrade locked in to global average temperatures, right? And we haven't mentioned the Amazon, we haven't mentioned forest fires, we haven't mentioned all the rest. We're out of time. That's the main message of tonight. We're out of time. We're out of time 2 years ago, right? When the last time I came. So we're out of time minus something now. So when Sir David King saying 2 to 3 years, that's what he means. He means 2 to 3 years. Maybe it's 5 years. Maybe it was last year. So here's my one fish away. Trying to keep it simple. So the key thing that we need to understand when we're thinking about how we're going to save the world, how we're actually going to stop these thousands of millions of people going through indescribable suffering for the next fucking 10,000, 100,000 years, is we have to understand this, right? And it's very straightforward and it's very horrific, but it's true. And that's what I'm here to say, right? Is that the situation is binary, right? We're either going to save the situation or we're not. Because that's what tipping points mean. Once you've gone over a tipping point, it means you can't catch it. You either catch it or you don't. So the analogy is the football. You take kids out to the park, you kick the ball, goes down the hill, goes overhead. You've got to catch it. You put some effort into it, you're not going to catch it, right? You're just not going to catch it. If you put a lot of effort into it, otherwise known as the climate movement, you're not going to catch it. You're only going to catch it if you go for number 3. That's just the way it is, right? I'm not trying to be rhetorical or dramatic or whatever. You understand, right? This is not like slavery. It's not like Hitler. It's not a linear situation, horrendous and obscene as those episodes in our history were. This is the first time in 10,000 years of human history, since the ice melted, right, that we are presented with a runaway situation that is going to destroy humanity by us doing nothing at all, right? The only way we're going to get ourselves in a ballpark of saving ourselves is by going for number 3. So what I'm going to suggest for the rest of this talk is what number 3 actually looks like, right? Which is my area of expertise, right? I mean, everything I've just told you for the last 15 minutes, one of you could have got up and told me, right? Told us. You know, it's not complicated, it's out there. It's all over the place. All right, so, as you know, I was involved in designing the April Rebellion of 2019 that changed world history, right? You know, it just did, didn't it? That's just, you know, struck lucky after 30 years of failure. Okay, so why did that happen? Why did that happen, right? So what we need to understand, if we're actually serious about doing what we need to do to get to number 3, we need to understand the non-linearity of political change, right? And by that I mean, if you're going to design an episode of civil resistance, an episode of civil disobedience, right, which is actually going to do the job. I'm not talking about going to D7 and dressing up and having a nice time, right? That's all well and good. But we all know that's not the main deal. The main deal is to actually work out what we're going to do, right? So in 2019, what we worked out is you have to do 4 or 5 different things and push them, right? If you just do one thing that's really good, then so what, right? You're not going to get anywhere. 2 things, maybe, you know, you need to do 4 or 5 things. So what did we do in 2019, right? We went to London, right? We didn't just stay there for 1 day, we stayed there for 10 days, right? Thousands of people went. It wasn't just a few hundred, there was thousands of people and they got arrested. And most importantly, we weren't just at Marble Arch, we were all over the place. That's what created a world event. If we'd just been at Marble Arch, we'd have been on page 5 of The Guardian for 3 days and everyone would have patted us on the head and we'd gone home. Now, if you were there at the time, you may remember this. There was no publicity to speak of until the Thursday, 4 days in, when the Times put it on the front page. And then it went non-linear, right? Then everyone was interested, and 4 days later, we're talking to Jeremy Corbyn, and they were doing, you know, nice things in Parliament about the climate emergency, right? The rest is history. So what we have to think about when we're designing something is, with the resources we've got, we have to take the risk to push ourselves into the ballpark of making that amount of impact. Anything less than that, we're not going anywhere, right? We're not going anywhere. It's just the way it is, because we're at the end of the time we have. So what resources have we got? Well, there's, let's see, 20 of us. Okay, so this is it gets interesting, right? We haven't got the 3,000 people. The 3,000 people, according to people in the judiciary, say there's 3,000 people engaged in civil disobedience to the point of arrest, then you're in the ballpark of a non-linear event, i.e. legislative change. So by getting to point 3, what we need to be focusing on is something that's actually going to reduce carbon emissions, right? Right? most of the time, people think they've got a success when someone pats them on the head, right? Go and talk to the UN, or you have a nice chat with Jeremy Corbyn. None of that matters unless you're actually reducing carbon emissions. How do you do that? Through legislative change. So the Insulate Britain project that I'm going to tell you about is a project to actually reduce carbon emissions, right? Keep that in our heads. That's the project here, not all the symbolic stuff. How does that actually happen? We know how it happens because we can look at the civil rights movement in the States, which had the same project, right? Which was to desegregate and attack racism in the South, right? And they did it through legislation. They did it through legislation by forcing the government. Okay, so that's the project. So we haven't got 3,000 people. We haven't got 80 people in the room going, yes, yes, let's go and sit in London. What we've got is 20 people in the room. So the good news is it's possible with 300 people. Okay, so that's what we're going for, right? There's COVID, everyone's miserable, everyone's trying to forget about climate change. We're not going to get 3,000 people before COP, but we could get 300. So what can we do with 300 people in order to create structural change? And that's what this project is about. So what I want you to understand is that this has happened many times in history. In fact, this is the main way history changes, when a few people inspired by the ethos of John Locke go out and do the right thing because it's true, right? In other words, it's not the numbers, as I said at the beginning of this talk, I wasn't joking, it's quality, not quantity. It's the purity of intent, the absolute determination to do whatever is non-violently necessary to change history, because it has to be done, right? It has to be done, right? More than any point in the last 10,000 years, in the next 6 months, we have to do what has to be done. Otherwise, the ball's over the cliff, right? So what can we do? So interestingly enough, this project, as I said, is inspired by the Freedom Riders. So what's happening in 1961? Everyone thinks like the civil rights movement was nice and dandy and, you know, nice and easy. Martin Luther King came along. They did a few, you know, mass civil disobedience actions, and suddenly racism disappeared. No, right? It was absolutely horrifically difficult. Horrifically difficult. Year after year after year, they were facing defeat. And in 1961, they'd had a big thing in Montgomery. Everyone was like, wow, this is amazing. It's a bit like 2019. It was a big whatever. And then it all went flat. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Right? That's why there's only us in the room. Right? And they were arguing about money and structure, you know, the routine. Right? And then what happened is a few people decided, right? 30 people, 24 people decided they were going to do whatever is necessary. And they got in the buses, as you probably know, the interstate buses. They went down to the deep south. They were beaten up. Their bush was set on fire. They went to prison, and they were on the front page. And the reason why they were successful is because they did whatever was necessary. And that's what these 300 people need to do. Okay. So let's look at the different elements in this proposal, right? What I want to say before I go through them is I've talked to quite a few people on Zoom, so I know some of the comeback. So there's always a bloke of a certain age, right? No disrespect, something like me, okay? Who afterwards goes, well, Roger, this and that, and therefore no, right? That's not the question. The question is, what is the alternative to this proposal, right? We are in the real world in an absolute crisis. If someone here has a better proposal, fantastic, right? I'm all in, right? But this is the collective intelligence of a number of people who have a lot of experience, right? Which doesn't mean it's going to work. What it means is it's more likely to work, right? And that's the real world question. So when you're listening to me, you have that little voice in your head going, well, that won't work. So don't do that. Go, well, if that won't work, what will, right? That's a lot more realistic question. All right. So time have we got? Oh, got to get a move on. I haven't even started on the project yet. I knew that would happen. All right, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because actually, seriously speaking, the main part of the talk is to get you into the space. The actual project itself is pretty straightforward, right? Once you understand the broader situation. So the first thing to say is if you're going to change history, as we have to do, then it makes sense to act at a point at which the opponent is structurally weak, either the government or the state or the regime, right? And we have the first opportunity, arguably in 20 years, to hit the British government at its point of most vulnerability in the climate issue, because as we all know, COP is coming up in November. No one's really bothered about COP. The point about COP is that Johnson will be trying to make himself out as Mr. Green and saying this and saying that with his media people and blah, blah, blah. We know the routine, right? If there's dozens of people going to prison, it's not going to look good, right? In other words, you have to choose your moment. And in 1961, one of the slightly boring reasons why the Freedom Riders won was because the Kennedys were going, we're the leaders of the free world, and it didn't look very good when black people were getting beaten up for sitting on a bus with a white person, right? That was a great propaganda coup for the Soviets, okay? So we've got this responsibility in Britain in 2001 to show the world what civil resistance looks like and get Johnson embarrassed, deeply embarrassed. When this happened, the Kennedys were apoplectic with rage, right? They said, go and sort it out, just get it sorted out. That's where we want Johnson. It's like, what do they want? Just get it sorted out. We want these people off the radar. We don't want them in the world's press. So that's the first sort of setting the scene thing, right? So we've got this opportunity. It's not going to come again, dare I say it. No, Britain's not that important anymore, dare I say it. Okay, so what's the second thing? So what's the actual action? The demand here, I'll say more about it, is to insulate the homes in Britain. I'll say more about it. So we're going to give a demand to the government in a Gandhi-esque way at the beginning of August and say, this is what we want you to do. If you haven't substantially responded to it, then we engage in civil disobedience, like Gandhi used to be. Okay? And then what we're going to do is go onto the motorways and block the motorways. Now, technically speaking, it's not going to be as scary as you think it's going to be because the traffic's going to be stationary. People are only going to go on in their affinity groups when the traffic's stationary. So there's certain places and times of the day that's going to happen. So it can be safe for the traffic. Okay? And if we don't go on the motorways, then people will be going on ring roads and various other things that we don't really need to know about. Okay? So why are we doing that? And this is another fundamental thing I need to communicate. Is you never get to point 3 unless you've got 10 million people saying what a twat you are, right? That's how history works, right? In other words, we have to do something with those 300 people, or 100 or 200, which will get in the national news. The only way you get in the national news is by disruption, high-level disruption. Why did the Freedom Riders get in the national news? Because they didn't go to Virginia, right? They went right into the depths of the Deep South, where they knew they'd be beaten up, right? Because they knew that that would get world news. We have to go onto the motorway, so there's nothing else we can do that will get us on the front page of the Sun. And maybe it won't happen, right? But it puts us in the ballpark, right? If we're doing bad things to bad people in central London with 100 people, we'll be on page 5 of the Guardian. I guarantee it, right? So that's why we have to do it, to create those 10 million conversations. The second thing is we have to keep doing it, right? With the Freedom Riders, they went down, they're all put in prison. 3 days later, another bunch of people did it, and then another bunch of people. It has to go on and on. It has to be a second wave. We have to recruit on the basis of it. We have to get on the phone, bring up all the Exile groups around the country and say, 20 people just being put into prison. What are you doing? You know, what are you doing about this situation? So the second element of it if Priti Patel's watching this video, hi. So Priti Patel's a key part, right, of the strategy, because, as you all know, she's law and order, which always helps, and she's going to go get them in prison. Okay, that's why they went to the Deep South, because they knew they'd be put into prison. So at the end of the Freedom Riders episode, there were 420 people in Parchman Prison in Mississippi, right? We need to fill the prisons with those 300 people. And we know what will happen. You go to the motorway, you'll be arrested, you might be arrested again, you go and do it again and again, and they'll put you in prison, right? Again, no absolute guarantees, but we've got Priti Patel on our side. All right, you know, I'm serious. That's what the civil rights movement do. Go and read about it. They went to do bad things to the worst guys because they get that reaction. This is how political change works, right? It's not about backing around on the edges. You go to the heart of the beast, the center of the carbon way of life, which is the modern motorway, right? And you're standing in front of the traffic saying, this is important for this country to think about where it's going. That's what we're saying, with that absolute righteousness, which is the tradition we're part of, right? And we know people have done that in the past, and a lot worse things have happened to them than standing in a motorway. Okay, so that's the second part of it. The third part of it is about insulation, right? This is a major shift, and it's a long time in the coming. But the point is here is that the climate crisis is a universal threat to all human values, right? So that electrician in the white van driving around Plymouth, his business is going to be destroyed in the next 10 years, right? His pension is going to be destroyed. In other words, it's a bread and butter issue, and we need to tell people it's a bread and butter issue. It's not a dolphins and whales issue. It is, but it's also a bread and butter issue. And we need to be saying what we want the government to do is insulate the houses of the poorest people in the UK, provides thousands of jobs, saves thousands of lives, and it actually reduces carbon emissions. According to the experts, it's the biggest no-brainer thing we should do, right? Per unit of investment. So we're splitting the opposition, right? Because all the radical right people and the tabloid press will be going, you know, those twats, you know, blocking the great British public. And then other people will be coming in from the building industry that we're going to talk about and say, yeah, we don't like them, but this has to be done and we can do it, right? So I was going to talk to the editor of the Sun, if he's watching. I'm going to have a chapter and say, which side of history do you want to be on? Because the working class of this country wants insulation, right? Because it's going to give them jobs, it's going to stop their grannies dying when they're 80 in their little houses and what have you, and it's going to do the job, right? We've already won the argument, right? It's not like in the American South in 1961, they hadn't even won the argument. We've won the argument, we did that 2 years ago. What we have to do now is force legislative change. And that's a function of disruption, sacrifice, and numbers, right? We've got 300 people, so we have to put the other two elements. Okay, so what's the fourth element? The fourth element is the dilemma demand, right? And this is straight out of the civil rights playbook, which is when you're engaged in this civil disobedience, it's not like, hey, let's go down to London and we want all these grand demands and no one really thinks they're going to happen. Right? We want something specific. When the Freedom Riders went down to the Deep South, they weren't going, racism's really bad. They were going, we want to desegregate the buses, full stop. We'll stop when we get them desegregated. We won't stop until they do, right? That's the structure of it. Now, no one was pretending that structural racism was going to get sorted out by desegregation. That wasn't the point. The point was to get the win. Right? Because once you've won something for the first time in 30 years, people can see it, right? One of the reasons only 20 people in this room is because we don't have any credibility, because we haven't actually won anything yet. We have to go out and say, this is how it works, right? And the biggest point about the Freedom Riders episode was it inspired another 1,000 campaigns, right? It proved that classical non-violence produces change, and that produced Selma and Birmingham and all the big Hollywood movie type stuff, right? So that's the real prize here, right? It's about inspiring people to re-galvanize the XR movement. You know, I can do as many little lectures as I like to XR, and I have done, about, yeah, we should all get out there, but nothing is like action. Action speaks 1,000 words. We have to actually go and actualize it. Okay, so there's 70 people. So we're aiming at 90 by the end of the evening. Okay, so we just started like doing these post-COVID talks. So we're pretty confident we get to 120. 120 is the conditional commitment limit. We're not going unless we get 120. Okay, well, if we get to 120, we're going for it because we have got this time, right? So we'll be going out, and then we'll have wave 2, and more people will come and do it, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to say is, although it sounds incredible, world history will depend on those 300 people. World history is going to depend on those 300 people. I mean, it's the most ridiculous thing to say, right? But unfortunately, I have to tell you the truth. And that is the situation. And what that means is it depends on each and every one of you in this room. Because as I said, you know, in other talks, there's what? 20,000 people in the room, but they're not here, right? And we've got 6 months. Depends on you. And another thing people say, you know, when they get out in the groups, you've heard it, you know, is I've got my job and I've got my relationship and I've got my house and I've got these commitments, right? The fact of the matter is, some people have to lose their jobs. Some people have to risk their relationships, right? Some people might be made homeless. Because that's what civil resistance looks like. That's what it is. That's what we're called to do. And if we don't, then we're going over the cliff. Okay, I'm going to finish with my 2 quotes. Got a respectable quote and an unrespectable quote. Okay, so we're a nice middle-class climate gathering in 2005, saying we've got a bit of a problem. This will be the quote. So it's from Albert Einstein, right? And no one can disagree with Albert. So he said, those that have the privilege to know have the duty to act. Privilege to know, that's us. Duty to act, that's it, right? We've just heard the situation. Okay. So the unpolite version is Larry Kramer, who in my scholarly view was the most successful campaign in the late 20th century. He was the guy who got ACT UP going in New York in the late 80s because of the AIDS crisis. Thousands of gay people were dying because the government didn't give a damn about providing them with medicines, right? So you know the routine. They were going on the committees, they were going to the hospital consultations, they were talking to their senators. Nothing happened. Sounds familiar, right? Larry Kramer came along and said, we're going to do whatever's necessary. Sounds familiar. We're going to do whatever's necessary. So what they did is they went and closed down the stock exchange, right? Someone said the other day, why are you blocking motorways if it's to do with insulation? It's like, we're blocking motorways because we're over this shit, right? They closed down the stock exchange because thousands of gay people were dying in New York. They were trying to have a public democratic conversation with America about, is this the America you want to live in? just like the Freedom Riders were, right? And then they went to the Catholic Cathedral, they closed down the Catholic Cathedral. They took the ashes of their dead lovers, right? And threw the ashes over the gates of the White House. They took the corpses of their dead lovers and showed them to the media. This is how political change works. It's not polite, it's not pretty, right? Never think non-violence is pretty, it never is, right? So what does he say? There's a long quote and a short one. Okay, do the long one. We didn't give a flying fuck what people thought of us, and that was our strength. The most successful campaigner in the late 20th century. Thank you very much.
It's my job to follow that, really. I'm going to speak for a very brief time of that. Is why I signed the conditional commitment, and why I stepped up. I've heard what you speak a few times.
Sorry, could you just move to
I've heard Roger speak a few times now, and my admiration increases as it's always different. The essential stuff is the same, but it's always different. And the first one I went to, I did a lot of head stuff about it. I did a lot of thinking, you know, I'm not quite sure about this. And I didn't like shouting something patriotic, all that stuff, you know. I have to speak louder. Yeah. Oh, sorry. And it made me think about when Exile started and how incredibly grateful I was, because like the rest of us here, I felt as if I'd been standing in a field for about 30 years on my own, watching the science and thinking, why is nobody taking any notice of this? Why is nobody doing anything about it? What are our leaders up to? And the science got clearer, 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 and still nobody was doing anything. And, you know, Greenpeace did particular things and Friends of the Earth did other particular things, and none of it made any difference to anything. And then came Exile, and I just felt deeply grateful, really deeply grateful, and was at the 19 rebellion, and it was fantastic. A climate emergency was declared. It's been declared in lots of places. What's happened? Nada. Nothing's happened. Nothing useful of any kind at all that's going to make any difference. And a couple of nights after I went to that workshop, there was another workshop called Trust and Courage. And I went to that, and one of the people there said, guess what, guys? 2 degrees for us is 3 degrees in Namibia. And in Namibia, 95% of the people are subsistence farmers. And they don't have the wherewithal, culturally or capitally or any other way, to adjust to that. And effectively, what we're doing by not changing any of this is signing Africa's death warrant. And suddenly, the prospect of being in prison in the UK, where I'm unlikely to get beaten up, especially as I'm a woman, actually, it's one of the few environments where a woman gets an easier time in prison than a man. I've people who've been in scrubs, that's pretty hard, heavy duty. Not impossible, and certainly a damn sight easier than Parchment Prison in Mississippi, where you can pretty much guaranteed to get beaten up. And I started to feel differently about it, and I remembered, I'm really difficult to say this bit, I remembered my granddaughter when she was 8, just before Exile, saying, how did you let it get like this now? And I had absolutely no answer. How did we let it get like this? How did I let it get like this? And suddenly I realised that Insulate Britain might have some shortcomings, but actually it's the only thing there is here that we can do. It's the only thing that is going to make a difference. I say this with the deepest respect to many of my closest friends who charged down to G7 and did all sorts of stuff. I've done stuff in Peru, outside the banks. Ditto, ditto, ditto. We've got to do the one thing that has got the most thought, the most analysis, the most carefulness behind it. And I personally need to do it so that I can. My grandson said, "Oh, don't go to prison, Mama. Please don't go to prison." What do you go to prison for? But he's younger. But as he's 12 now, she's beginning to understand. And our great hope, of course, is in some of the younger people who get this, who really get this. And the other thing that persuaded me was a strange understanding, and I hadn't thought about this before, that actually, because Exile started in the UK, people all around the world take their cue from us. And so what we do in terms of this action will be echoed and responded to in many countries. That's what matters. So that's why I sign up, and that's why I hope none of you leave the room without having very, very seriously considered signing up or even signing up.
So now you get a chance to talk about how this has landed with you. What's your response? Just an opportunity to talk amongst ourselves about what we've heard. I'm going to divide into 3 groups. Have easy conversations. Some people in here, some people in the room, which is downstairs, in my lobby, and the cafe, which is right next to reception. So I'm going to suggest that you don't go with your friends. Okay, go with the people that you don't recognise in the room, and sort yourselves out. Those of you who come as a group, then make sure you go in different places. But I think it's a good thing to have the conversation with strangers. That might not be possible, but with some people that you don't know. So Di, if you could go down to Ramay, and you go down with Di. I'll stay in here, and Peter, maybe you could stay in here with me. And Pippa, could you go to the cafe here as well? Yeah, so okay, 4 to 5 people in each, 4 plus the facilitators that I just named. The groups of 4. Thank you. And we've got about half an hour, 35 minutes until. Okay, so let's.
Where am I going? I need to. A specific one. Downstairs to